Okay, seems like we have a critical mass of folks, and in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative Winter Webinar Series. This is the first of 3 presentations for 2026. We'll actually have our next one 2 weeks from today on March 4th, and then a final one on March 11th, all more or less themed around fire and fire management, or at least has some component of fire. My name is Jamie Ellis. I work as the Natural Areas Coordinator at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and I am part of the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative advisory team. The Prairie Reconstruction Initiative is a community of prairie practitioners and researchers from more than 30 organizations with support from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, working together to discover ways to improve the practice of prairie reconstruction. Our mission is to build an engaged community of practice who work together to overcome uncertainties through all phases of prairie reconstruction. We envision prairie reconstructions that are biologically diverse, ecologically functional, and resist invasion by non-native plants. We focus our activities on evidence-based tools and peer-to-peer learning. We developed a prairie reconstruction vegetation monitoring protocol and built and maintained a prairie reconstruction database that continues to grow. By pooling and analyzing data for many reconstructions, we hope to reveal pivotal elements that will increase the likelihood all reconstructions meet expectations. Our learning opportunities include both in-person and online events where the PRI community can exchange experiences and knowledge with each other. We believe these insights from both individual experiences and scientific investigation lead to our collective success. During the presentation today, cameras and microphones, your cameras and microphones will be turned off. But I will turn those back on for you at the end for questions and comments. But if you have a question during the presentation, please type questions and comments for the speaker in the chat, and we will get to them. Either Molly or me or Amanda McColpin is helping out today as well. We'll get to them at the end of the presentation. And this session is being recorded, and we plan to upload it to the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative YouTube channel later this year. So today, our speaker is Molly Tranel Nelson. She has been a research specialist for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, Parks and Trails Division for the past 15 years. Prior to that, she was a farmland prairie habitat specialist for the Wildlife Research Program with the DNR Fish and Wildlife. In her current position, she oversees protection and management of the natural and cultural resources in state parks and trails for Southwest Minnesota. Her work includes working with 2 bison herds as a founding team member of the Minnesota Bison Conservation Herd. And as many of us with taxonomic expertise, her family regularly calls her with obscure descriptions of birds they see and expects her to ID them, which I'm sure she does graciously. So today, Molly will talk to us about her experience meeting the challenges of effectively managing prairie with, and sometimes without, fire and grazing. So Molly, thanks for being here. I'll stop
All right.
sharing my screen so you can share yours, and we'll get started.
All right. Okay, can you see my screen all right?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks for that introduction, Jamie. I'm happy to be here today. I'm currently in the metro area at University of Minnesota, but I'm stationed in our New Ulm area. And I have a 32 county work area, so most of southern Minnesota. And I have the pleasure of managing our state parks, our trails, and hundreds of public water access sites within those counties. I like to say that I have the best job in state parks because I don't have to wear a uniform, I don't have to work weekends, and I don't have to clean bathrooms. But what I do get to do is do fire and other management in our natural resources, and help protect both the natural and cultural resources in our parks. So I feel pretty lucky to do that. Okay, let's see why my screen is not advancing. There we go. All right. So our overview today, I'm going to just kind of walk you through this concept of conservation grazing, and I think we'll probably have a wide range of backgrounds in the audience here. So I am going to just give some historical and ecological context on grazing, and then what is conservation grazing and how that fits in to writing a grazing plan. And then I'll give you some examples we have that we are currently doing of different types of grazing in state parks, including bison, goats, and cattle. And I will say I do give a separate talk just on bison grazing, just on goat grazing, and just on how to write a grazing plan. So I'm trying to squish it all together today, so it might feel a little disjointed. But then throughout that, we will also be talking a lot about monitoring and then adapting based on what you're seeing with the monitoring. So just keep that in mind. So I want to take you back to Minnesota. And if you're not in Minnesota, think of your state in the context of the tall grass prairie areas and what it used to look like in the Pleistocene, over 12,000 years ago, and even back even further than that. We had glaciers coming in, moving back and forth, and creating these large savanna and prairie areas. And what evolved were lots of large mammals, and particularly large herbivores. And so I love this picture just to kind of make you think of what it looks like. But also we had a researcher do some studies in the New Ulm area where I work, and actually right behind my office. And in the river there, they can use the sediments that wash out in the riverbank and find these fossils and these bone fragments, and they can date them and age them. And so they were studying the Pleistocene, and they found this cervid, which was probably an elk. They found wild boar, and then of course our bison, which we all knew that were out here. So it's just kind of fun to see like what used to be there on my actual office area. And then I start thinking about like how much we've lost. So we know that we've really lost a lot of these keystone species that were grazers. And so here's an example of our elk that lived in Minnesota's hardwood forest, brushlands, and prairies. So by about 1880, we've lost them through half the state. And then fast forward to 1900, we just have a few small elk herds. And today we have a couple herds up on the Canadian border that are very small. So ecologically, elk are pretty much extinct in Minnesota. Due to settlement and hunting, there was a market for it once European settlers started moving across the state. The elk would have eaten grasses and forbs during the summer, but then they switched to woody browse in the winter. So I like to think of all my shrub problems maybe would have been not so bad if we had a big herd of elk out there to browse some of that woody shrubs in the winter. And then, of course, we have our bison that used to roam across Minnesota as well. And here's a picture of where they were in the whole North America. And we had two kinds of bison. We had the wood bison, which would have been in our hardwood forest, which we call the arrowhead of Minnesota. And then we had our American plains bison that were more brushlands and prairies. And those are the bison I'll be discussing today, are the American plains bison. So again, same story, European settlement happened. And while bison were hunted by Native Americans for many years, it was really this European settlement that started them on the decline. As markets opened up, a war began, between the Native people and the US government. And there was a purposeful, I guess, bounty on bison to remove them as a food source for the Dakota people. So bison were targeted and removed for that reason. And so by the 1880s, the last wild bison was seen in Minnesota. And in fact, if people would report a bison seen outside of town, everyone would grab their guns and run and try to go get it. So they did not fare well at this point in time. And so, again, we lost a keystone species across Minnesota. And differing from elk is that bison mostly graze on grasses. And even in the winter, they use their heads as a kind of a snow shovel, and they can get down to those grasses. So they're not really browsing on those woody species. So as land managers, we're really missing this important piece of the puzzle. These prairies have evolved over time to respond to grazing pressure. And so as we try to either restore or manage the lands that we have that are remnants, we are kind of missing these pieces. And from an ecosystem services perspective, it can look like nutrient cycling as poop is deposited out on the prairie, and that can impact everything from dung beetles to the plants that need those nutrients. This can impact the soils with fungi and bacteria, and as ruminants have things in their gut that passes through, that can help build those healthy soils. Hoof action to work seeds into the soil or to open up bare spots for seeds and other things that like that bare ground, maybe like a nesting bee. And then of course the biomass removal, lowering that litter layer, just kind of opening up the light for other plants to get through. So our challenge really today is how do we mimic some of these past grazing practices using what we have now, and how do we get some of those ecosystem services back? So, one of the most obvious answers is modern livestock grazing, but then we also have mechanical removal like haying and forestry mowing. And of course, we're always trying to do fire as well. So this idea of conservation grazing has really been important in Minnesota to kind of define that we are not grazing the way maybe my grandpa did. I grew up on a farm, and my dad also grazed, but they would just put the cows out there in May and then come get them by maybe September, and then that was it. Like they just grazed everything out there all the time. So that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about conservation grazing. So I like this definition that the Wildlife Society of Minnesota created. And so I'm just going to highlight some of these. It's really the reason you're doing it is the habitat management objectives. And you're going to hear me kind of say that a couple times about objectives and goals. Why are you putting them out there, and what is your goal? And then also you're really trying to mimic that grazing and browsing by the wild animals. So, just like bison wouldn't have stayed in the same spot from May to September, we're not going to have cattle staying in the same spot either. And then the same position statement defines when grazing is effective. And so again, you have to have those clearly defined objectives. You have to consider ahead of time the potential effects of grazing on the resources that you do have out there. This could be the plants, the soil, the water. Maybe you have a rare jumping mouse or a rusty patch bumblebee, so you have to think about all those things. And then using it as a flexible management tool that's going to allow you to alter the stocking rate and the timing and the specifics of how you graze. And then again, you're going to want to monitor that to see if you're reaching those clearly defined goals. And if you're not, then you get into that adaptive management piece. And I don't want you to be scared by adaptive management, because there can be some really rigorous definitions of that. I'm just referring to, like, what are you going to do if it's not working? Okay, so it's kind of more a loose idea of adaptive management. And it's driven by field-based results. So the first thing we always do when we want to graze a particular area that we haven't grazed before is we start putting together a conservation grazing plan. And so what we do, because I'm with the DNR, we have kind of a rigorous environmental review process that makes sure we're not impacting any like rare or endangered features. So it's pretty formal for us, but a private landowner could do this in a less formal way. So we first of all define our goal of the grazing, those objectives, and I'll walk us through some of those in a minute here. We're going to describe the grazing area, and then we're going to identify any sensitive resources, like I mentioned, that rusty patch bumblebee. So this picture here is a plan of Minneopa State Park, the part of the park that we do the bison grazing in. When we first put bison out there, we did not have rusty patch bumblebee, but about 5 years ago, we found them out there. So then we had to update the plan and kind of consider that. So we're also gonna put in any grazing details on the animal units, the duration, how we're gonna rotate them, how we're gonna do the fencing and watering. And then, as I mentioned before, this monitoring and contingency plan is gonna be clearly outlined. And then we do have our plans reviewed by a grazing specialist or an ecologist. It's always good just to have a second set of eyes, especially if someone has a different perspective and doesn't come from the same background as you. That always helps you get to a better plan in the end. So if anyone's written a burn plan, it's very similar, where you have your contingency, your sign-offs, all that kind of thing. So again, here is our Minneopa State Park plan, and I'm just going to show you what our grazing goals were for that plan. The first one is to restore and maintain the bison range as southern dry sand gravel prairie. Most of the prairie in that range, which is 330 acres, was identified as this classification. Some of the areas are actually old fields and formerly farmed little brome and Kentucky bluegrass patches. But our goal was to kind of maintain it at this level. We also wanted to reduce and maintain invasive species percent cover at less than 20%. So this park had a history of lots of grazing until about the 1970s, when cattle were removed and it became a state park. And then I'd say it didn't have a lot of disturbance. They tried to burn every once in a while, but it wasn't a regular burn routine. And what happened is the prairie, kind of got invaded with invasives that have been there a long time. There was a lot of thistle problems, Canada thistle. And then over time, the woody encroachment really moved in. So our oak savannas became chocked full of buckthorn, and sumac and American plum were pretty much throughout a lot of the range. So our second goal was to remove some of that woody plant and keep the woody plant percent cover at less than 10%. And I will say this was very ambitious for what was out there at the time. And we didn't intend grazing to meet that. That was in combination with other resource management efforts like forestry, mowing, fire, things like that. And then our second one was our fourth one was to provide a mosaic of habitats for grassland dependent species. And we were thinking mostly of birds when we wrote this one. And we would measure that through structural diversity and visual obstruction readings. And we do a little bit of bird monitoring, but it's not very rigorous out there. But really, we wanted to have those patchy areas that different species of birds could use. And then provide forage for about 35 bison year-round with only winter supplemental prairie hay, so we didn't want to have to feed them. We just provide hay in the winter in case we were to have a lot of snow. We don't want the bison to push the fences and decide that they want to roam somewhere else. And then the final one was we set a forage consumption, or also called a utilization rate, at 50%. And this is another way that conservation grazing differs from kind of your private land, more production grazing, is that 30 to 50% is usually kind of the utilization rate on conservation grazing, and it's usually much higher in a production setting. So I'll just kind of walk through some of the actual pieces of the grazing plan, and this explains like the how of your, like how am I going to graze? So the first thing you have to consider is your stocking rate, and this is how many animals per acre, and it's measured in animal units, and it is based on the weight of the animal. So this picture of this cow here would be, she would be 1 animal unit. And in the spring, when she has her calf, we still pretty much consider her 1 animal unit because the calf is nursing, she's lost a bunch of weight. But by the fall, that calf is starting to put on a lot of weight. She's put her weight back on, and they could be closer to 1.25 animal units by then. So we actually use a scale, and we measure them every fall before we go into winter to kind of estimate. And before we had a scale, we were estimating, and we found we were actually quite a bit off. So a scale is helpful. And then the next thing we have is our utilization rate. And this is, again, how much of the available forage do you want them to eat? But you need to know how much available forage is out there. So this can be done with grass clippings or forage clippings, where you collect it all in a set area, you dry it in like a drying oven, and then you weigh it. And there's some great estimates that you can use then as well to help you figure out like how much you have for total forage out there. Then you're going to think about your timing, and this is how long are the bison going to graze out there, or the cattle. And so for bison, we have them out there 365 days a year. So that's less important, but like when we do our goat grazing, both timing and seasonality are super important, and you have to calibrate it to the exact plant species you're targeting. For example, when we target garlic mustard, we want them in early spring, because if it bolts to a certain point, then they don't like to eat it anymore. So sometimes it can mean the difference between success or not if you don't get that timing right. And then how are you going to rotate them? Are you going to have interior paddocks? Are you going to use patch burn grazing, which is what we do with the bison? Or a lot of producers are now going to this virtual fencing, which is basically like if you have a GPS collar for your dog, it's kind of the same thing. And like with goats and sheep, they can train them to an area, and you can move them to a new paddock on your phone just by moving the virtual fence. So kind of some amazing technology coming out on that. A couple more elements. These are all kind of your logistics. So I mentioned fencing. For goats, we use, an electric woven wire fence. For bison, we don't electrify it. Watering, you might have natural water, but if you don't, here's a picture of one of our paddocks where we don't have natural water, and they just bring in this wagon that they leave there the entire time the goats are out there, and then it's pretty easy way to bring water in. You're also going to have to think about what do you do in a drought, or what do you do in a flood, or if storms, trees fall down in your fence, that kind of thing. And then one thing people maybe don't think about, it's super important for our bison herds, but also important for the goat herds, is how to keep your herd isolated from other herds and other wildlife. So how far away is the nearest herd, and are they healthy? And do you share a water source with them? And why this is important is, so like in Minnesota, 30% of dairy herds can have a disease called Johne's. And if our bison are sharing a water source with a dairy herd upstream, our bison could potentially get that disease. And so we try to keep everything very isolated. And in fact, when we're looking at places to reintroduce bison, that's one of the number one questions we ask is this herd going to be isolated, and can we keep them away from other livestock? So I'll jump into our bison grazing example more deeply here, but I want to give you kind of a background on our Minnesota bison conservation herd. So we've had bison at Blue Mountain State Park since about 1961, and that herd was there for many years, and then we started getting interested in the genetics of that herd and found out that they were pretty diverse and there wasn't a lot of cattle in aggression. So we started more aggressively managing the herd and reintroducing bison in new locations so that we could grow our herd size. So we manage it all as one genetic herd, but we have 3 current locations where we swap the genetics between these animals. Minneopa State Park got animals in 2014, and then Dakota County owns Spring Lake Preserve, and they manage a bison herd that we work together with. They got their animals in 2022, and right now they're still fairly small and growing at 8 animals, so they're kind of on their way. And then exciting to announce that Camden State Park will be reintroducing bison. Our plan is to have hooves on the prairie in fall of 2029. So we will eventually be up to 4 locations. And then the Minnesota Zoo actually also has animals at the zoo on exhibit that are part of this herd and part of the genetics of this herd. And so while they are not free ranging, they are also managed as part of this herd. So in most of our locations, we do patch burn grazing to move the animals around rather than interior fences. So at Blue Mounds, we burn on about a 3-year interval. The patches are very large, over 200 acres, and we burn it typically in May. There's a lot of brome out there, and so we're trying to set that back and increase the native grasses. So we do kind of a green season, growing season burn, and it's very smoky and low and patchy. And this top right-hand picture, you can see there's still unburned areas and kind of a lot of patchiness to it. And then at Minneopa, we do more of a 4-year interval with smaller burns. Most of them are around 40 acres. There is one unit that's 100 acres, and that one's kind of, it's an oddball, mostly brome unit as well, but the rest are native grass dominated. These are more complete burns because they do have that kind of native grass component that just burns a lot hotter, and we mix it up between spring and fall burns at this unit, and the bison will move themselves around the paddocks based on what was recently burned. And then Spring Lake does it a little differently. They do have interior fencing, and so they physically move their bison from paddock to paddock, and then they also have a burn program, but they're not technically patch burn grazing. So here's just a picture of, you know, at the end of the year, I make a GIS map of what we did. And so I kind of put all the different years on here, and you can see the different colors are the different years we burned. In one particular year, we were burning just a ton of paddocks because we had to do archaeological review, and they like it when we burn because then they can find all the artifacts really easy. So we burned more that year than we typically did, so that's why there's so much pink. But you can see, if you think about patch burn grazing, it's a quilt with different patches on it, so you're going to see all the different colors. And if I was a bird species flying around out there, I could pick whichever one suited my habitat best, right? Like whatever I preferred. So before we started grazing at Minneopa, we had been doing some monitoring as part of the Grassland monitoring team, which some of you may have heard is kind of a multi-agency, multi-state effort to monitor what native kind of remnant prairies are doing throughout the region. And so we had adopted that protocol before we knew we were getting bison. So this protocol isn't great at specifically measuring grazing, But we had 2 years of this monitoring prior to the bison reintroduction, so we stuck with it instead of trying to switch to a very specific grazing monitoring. Also, it helps inform a larger data set across the state, and so we felt it was important to keep that in there. So we do have control transects that we put outside the range that we added once we knew we were getting bison. And then we monitor every 3 years, except we did have like a drought year where there was just nothing to monitor, so then we did it the following year instead. We also take photo plots throughout the range. So we measure along these 25-meter belt transects, and there's plots along the transect, and there's 5 transects per management unit. So if it's a burn unit of 40 acres, there'll be at least 5 transects in there, and then there'll be plots all along that transect. So we take visual obstruction readings, litter depth, we look at plant groups, all invasive species, and then there's a native species checklist as well. So you've got, percent cover, absence, abundance, and then we also, I said litter already. So those are kind of the things that we're measuring. Okay, so here's just a sneak peek of the data because we are actually still entering 2025 right now. So I just have 2 units that I pulled out, and we haven't like statistically analyzed and done the full analysis on these. This is just kind of wanted to show a sneak peek for this talk, so just some basic stuff. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll publish an entire paper with full statistical analysis, but we're not there yet. So this is just looking at the change in the percent cover from 2015 when we first started with bison to 2025. And so we broke it out into 3 categories: woody, invasive, or native percent cover. And you can see in the unit 5 to your left here, there was a lot of woody material in there in the beginning, and then there was some invasives, and then there's a decent amount of native cover. And so what we did in unit 5 is, of course, it got grazed by bison because all these units are within the bison range. It got burned twice, and it got forestry mowed at least 4 times, and then spot sprayed after they'd forestry mow, they'd spot spray the resprouts, mostly sumac, also a little bit of buckthorn, and there was some plum in there that was covering up some of the nice prairie. So they would spot spray the woody species resprouts. And I'd say unit 5 was like our most aggressive on getting rid of woodies out there. So that's why I wanted to show this unit, and then we'll compare it to another unit where we weren't as aggressive with the woody removal. So you can see we were successful in getting rid of the sumac out there because it went down to pretty much like 1% from starting at over 25% within 10 years. And if people drive out there, there is quite a bit of difference. It's starting to look like an open prairie again instead of kind of this encroached brushland, which brushlands are important too. But we knew that historically this was a more open prairie, and that's what our goal was. But unfortunately, as we removed those woody species, our invasives really jumped up, and our natives stayed, they increased slightly, but they mostly stayed the same. And I attribute those invasive species to probably be Kentucky bluegrass and brome in there. I will like to kind of pull out the grasses versus forbs in some of these categories to see if that holds true. But I think when we got rid of that sumac and opened up that light, there's just a ton of Kentucky bluegrass or POA out there across the range, and it did really well once we got rid of the sumac. So, and of course, Kentucky bluegrass likes to be mowed, right? That's your lawn grass. So it likes to be grazed as well. And bison love to eat it, but they don't really control it because it does well under a grazing regime. So I think that's why we saw such a big jump in invasives. So let's jump to the right side of the screen in Unit 14, which is a much different unit. It's a unit that had a heavier component of native grass, and in particular, little bluestem. And so, of course, this one also got grazed, and we burned it twice. But there was only one forestry mow, and there was no spraying. And so we were not as aggressive on the woody species in this particular unit. And so you can see, started with a very similar, maybe even more amount of woody cover. And then by the end, we did reduce the woody cover by probably about half. But the invasive species really went down, which is cool to see. And the natives really increased. And I suspect that most of the natives were grasses that increased. But we will pull that forb out there and look at those as well. But yeah, I think because there was already just quite a bit of little bluestem. And actually the bison do not seem to graze the little bluestem heavily. They will eat it, but it's not their preferred. So I think this paddock also just like flourished in little bluestem that the bison weren't particularly eating. So I just wanted to compare one more thing to show you as a sneak peek is two cool season grasses that we have out there. And I mentioned one already is the POA, or the Kentucky bluegrass. We put all POA together because it was hard to ID sometimes grazed little pieces of things. And then we did the dicantheliums, which are like the Scribner's panic grass. I think we have Lieberg's panic grass out there. So just the panic grasses, which are these short, they tend to be around some of our rock outcrops or really dry areas. I failed to mention that Minneopa Bison Range is really crappy soils and prairie. That's why it wasn't farmed. It's rocky. There's lots of rock outcrops, and the soils are only about 18 inches deep. So it's not a super productive, like big tall grass prairie above your head in these like heavy loam soils. It's mostly like kind of marginal farmland that survived because it couldn't be farmed. So you can see here that we really increased both of these cool season grasses, but especially the dicantheliums. And we are just seeing a ton of it out there, which is pretty cool. I think as they ate the taller grasses like big bluestem, Indian grass, prairie dropseed, these kind of shorter grasses really were able to take off. And I don't have the sedges mapped on here or plotted on here, but we were also seeing an increase in native sedges as well. So this is just kind of like an observation in what we're seeing out there. And I don't have the data and graphs to show that yet, but just kind of 10 years of what we've been seeing, and just playing around with the early analysis of the transects we do have entered, we are seeing these observations holding true. So low growing forbs are increasing, and two that are definitely going to be significant are longleaf bluets, which I have a picture of here. Never saw them out there before bison, and now you see them out there bluing all the time, and you know they're really easy to find. So either they're increasing or they're easier to see, maybe a little bit of both. And then world milkweed seems to just be increasing across several of the units. That unit 5 that I mentioned, where we took out all the sumac, just a ton of world milkweed. And in fact, we saw all sorts of larval monarchs in that paddock this year because of the milkweed. We weren't seeing lots of, I was kind of worried that we'd be having all these huge bare areas because of the wallows. You can see a picture of the wallow here. We are seeing them, but they weren't too bad and weren't concerning us at all. Carex species were increasing. I kind of mentioned this, the big blue, Indian grass, and prairie dropseed were all decreasing. We are finding more rare plants, especially around the rock outcrops, and I think this is probably a detectability issue. Areas that started weedy kind of stayed weedy. We're not being able to control that POA and brome with grazing, as I mentioned. They're not reducing the shrubs by grazing, but we are reducing them with our other management activities, and we are hitting that structural diversity patchiness. So I kind of mentioned all this already, but just we were able to adapt our grazing once we started seeing some of these monitoring results, because we do it every 3 years. So during the drought year, we had 2 droughts back to back. And so we did have to reduce our herd size by half by that second year of drought. And that could be a really hard thing, but we already had that written into our grazing plan. So it was just a matter of telling the manager, okay, we've hit this trigger point where we're seeing more than 50% utilization of the grass out there. We need to reduce the herd. And so that's what we did. And then also with the patch burn grazing, when we first started off, our herd was small and our patches were large, and the grass was growing up too quickly for them. So we actually had to reduce the amount that we were burning in the paddock. We had started with about 30%, and then we narrowed it down to about 10%, and that worked better for the patch burn grazing. And then one year when we saw all the larval monarchs, we decided not to burn in that unit. We were going to do a fall burn there, and we decided against it. So just using some of that information to inform our decisions. Okay, so I'll jump really quick into goat grazing, and I have an entire talk on goat grazing, so this will be quick. But we use goats mainly for woody invasives, but also for that garlic mustard and Dame's rocket. And we've been really successful with those species. So I will just say, if people want to learn more about that, just contact me, because there's a lot of nuance to it. But we use meat goats. We contract it out, so we are paying someone to bring in goats that are specialized on eating invasives, because each herd's going to be a little bit different. So just getting your neighbor's goats to come over may or may not work. And then we are starting to use more sheep and goats and mixing them, because they do graze differently. And so based on your objectives, you might want to consider that. I'll run through this quick. So the biggest point here is make sure you're not just doing 1 year of goat grazing, because that can make it worse. You could actually germinate all your seeds that are in the soil by opening up that canopy and making it worse. So repeated periodic browsing works best. Don't panic if everything is dead and looks horrible. With goat grazing, we're doing usually a 90% utilization rate. So it is kind of that nuclear, nothing's left green in the paddock, but that's how it works best with goats. And then goats are great ambassadors. Our parks, our visitors love them, and visitation actually increases when we have goats. And then just the final thing, real quick, I have about 1 minute left here, is we do a little bit of cattle grazing. I'd say it's less popular in state parks, but we are doing some short duration, high intensity grazing, mostly for brome setback and to allow native forbs that are already out there to express. So Glacial Lake State Park is one of the parks that are doing this, with Cindy Luth working on that. And she said that the results are similar to a prescribed burn. So, you burn, and then that following growing season, you get all these forbs blooming, and that's similar to how their grazing results are. And the reason they're using cattle instead of fire is because Glacial Lakes has Dakota skipper butterfly, which are pretty much twinking out in Minnesota, and they're working with the Minnesota Zoo to do a reintroduction project there. And really, we're finding that they need these forbs to survive, but they also need the native grasses, and they can be really vulnerable to fire when they're in those larval stages on the native grasses. So grazing works great there, where we can maybe protect the butterflies a little better. So that was a whirlwind. I'm ready for any questions. Hopefully we have enough time. And feel free, here's my email to reach out to me because I did cover a lot here rather quickly. So there may be some questions.
Molly, thank you so very, very much for
Yeah.
that presentation. I am um, allowing mics and cameras for everybody right now, but if you have a question, go ahead and ask it or type it into the chat. So it looks like here's a question coming in from Joseph. Would you aim for 50% utilization rate for cattle grazing too?
I would say it would depend on the type of grazing you're doing. So, like at Glacial Lakes, they were doing more of a high intensity, what's sometimes called mob grazing, where you put a lot of animals in a small area and then they just either trample or eat everything. So then you're going to be at that higher than 50% part. But if the cattle were out there for a longer period of time and doing maybe more like patch burn grazing, then you could be at that 50%. So it kind of depends on all the other factors like the stocking rate and the timing.
Molly, I'd like to follow up on that because that's caught my attention, and I'm curious, how did you come up with the 50% available forage, or at least a target
Yeah,
of 50% utilization rate, or what goes into
sure.
figuring
It's
that
a
out?
it's a little bit arbitrary because like Dakota County actually uses a 30% utilization rate. They were a little more conservative than us. So it kind of depends on the manager. But we kind of based ours on we had already had a herd at Blue Mounds for a long time, and so we felt comfortable with that 50%. But I will say, 30% leaves you more room for error. So when we got to that drought amount and we were already at 50%, and then all of a sudden the grass did not grow the entire summer, people were asking me why we sprayed the grass, and it was actually the grass was dying. That's how dry we were. And
Oh
I was
my.
freaking. I was like, they have nothing to eat. We got to get them out of there. The bison were actually at a body weight rating of fat. They were utilizing it so well. It just shows you that bison are just evolved to the prairie, where a beef cow would have been like dying out there. And the bison were just like, we're fine. But we did have to really reduce the herd then because we were already up at that 50%. So if you want more room for error, I'd say shoot more towards the 30%.
Okay. Thank you so very much. Here's a question from Jacob. Curious, where does the prairie hay for winter bison feed come from? And
Sure.
what time of year is prairie hay cut or made?
Yeah, so we do try to wait till after August 1st to cut it for the nesting birds. So it's actually not the most nutritional hay, but they also technically don't need it because they have enough forage out there without it. So it's kind of a cheat that we just don't want them to jump the fence or knock the fence down by looking for extra feed. So that's kind of why we provide the hay. So nutritionally, technically, they don't need it. But we do, most years, the hay comes from another part of the park. So like at Blue Mountain State Park, we have a rotation where we can't burn as much of the park as we'd like to, especially this area right along the highway. And so we hay that after August 1st, and then that hay is provided back to the bison. And then at Minneopa State Park, we actually were able to buy a piece of property that floods down in the river valley, and it was all planted to big blue stem. And so we use that as our hay field. And the areas that we didn't hay are actually all like solid cottonwoods right now. So we're deciding haying's a really good management technique to keep those floodplains open.
Oh, wonderful. You mentioned some changes in the botanical divert, some botanical changes, the vegetation changes you were seeing. So I'm wondering also about changes in abundance or diversity overall. And I'm thinking of this because just yesterday, Elizabeth Bach from the Nature Conservancy at Nachusa Grasslands, they had bison that they put on their reconstructions there at that project in about 2014, and they also set up some exclosure studies as well, just so they to monitor and changes in vegetation. And overall, generally, since the they put bison on their prairies, they haven't seen really big or noticeable or statistical differences in vegetation abundance or diversity. So what have you been seeing on your sites?
Well, I do think the woody changes are definitely from our other
Mm.
management types, so those I would not attribute to bison. But the increase in low-growing forbs, I would, some of that's going to be with the sumac also getting cut. But a lot of it, I think, is bison because they're grazing around these rock outcrops pretty hard.
Mm.
And a lot of these plants, and we're even seeing more like very rare plants. That our botanists even had a hard time IDing and that were new records for the county.
Wow.
And they're like 3 inches tall. So I think the bison are just opening up these areas where these short things can grow more. And like with the world milkweed, we're definitely seeing that spreading throughout, just more abundant. We're finding it in more transects, and we're finding world milkweed's a tough one to figure out percent cover because it's this spindly little thing, but the percent cover is increasing as well. So yeah, I just think like they are definitely eating a lot of the native taller grasses, and that's allowing kind of the shorter stuff to come through. I will say we had this great plan to put GPS ear tags on our bison, and I was going to have these heat maps of exactly where they're grazing. And it turns out bison are really hard on these. These are GPS tags created for rhinos in Africa, and they ripped them all out. So
Oh my.
um, yeah, the tags were not as successful. They only lasted a few months, and we had a lot of issues with them. So I don't have those wonderful heat maps that I thought I would have to look at my vegetation changes and where the grazing intensity was. But yeah,
Wow. Yeah, that would be amazing, but instructive in another way, right?
yeah.
Okay, Amanda asks, you discussed various natural grazers that have been extirpated. How would you compare grazers and browsers that we still have, like deer, rodents, rabbits, etc., and what they tend to eat?
Well, I'll pick out the rabbits there because at Minneopa State Park, it has the highest population of eastern cottontails that I think I've ever seen. And in our last heavy snow year, they killed a bunch of top killed a bunch of sumac, like thousands of stems, and that's the first time I had ever seen like a noticeable browse by rabbits being able to make an effect in our park. But typically populations aren't high enough for us to see that. I would say so the elk we used to have, I would compare goats to that, like in how they eat, although they don't eat as high up as an elk's much taller. But the deer are kind of a mixed bag. The deer tend to eat all my nice forbs like orchids and milkweeds and things I don't want them to eat. They tend not to eat the invasives. They'll do a mix of, they're in the woods a lot more, but in our prairie parks, we actually see very large herds of deer. Like at Blue Mounds, there'll be a herd of 100 deer in the bison range during the winter, but during the summer, you don't tend to see that. Yeah, and then the rodents, another thing to think about is we used to have Richardson's ground squirrels and all these other, small herbivores that probably had a really big impact because their numbers were so high. And those are much lower now than they were traditionally as well. So I've always had a dream of reintroducing Richardson ground squirrels and reintroducing burrowing owls. So maybe
Oh, that
someday.
that would be amazing. Here's a question from Joseph that I'm whoops, here we go. Do you think cattle grazing can be manipulated to mimic bison grazing, or is that simply not possible?
Yeah, I think definitely some of the more rotational grazing or the mob grazing where you're moving them, they can definitely do that. And a lot of our wildlife management areas are using grazing and are seeing some good results with that. I think Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge also has some oak savanna with cattle and some
Mhm.
wetlands that they're grazing that they're getting interesting results on as well. So I think the more people experiment with timing and seasons, the key with cattle is people still need to make money, on their cattle. So you're getting a herd from somewhere. We're typically not paying a cattle guy. They're bringing them in and they get free grazing, right? So I think it's hard to find that producer that wants to move them every day or wants to put that many cows in a small paddock, that kind of thing. So that's where the challenge lies.
Great, thank you. And then Jacob asked, so would you say bison are being introduced at Camden State Park more for conservation purposes or as a public attraction or another purpose? In other
Sure.
words, what is the primary motivation for park to choose to reintroduce bison?
Yeah, so we actually have some set criteria that we look at. And first of all, the goal to put them at another location is because our herd right now is not at a number that's large enough to conserve the genetic diversity.
Mhm.
So our goal is 500, but honestly, that's even a little low for genetic diversity. You probably want like 1,000. So um, the more animals we have in our conservation herd, the better our genetic preservation over time is. So that's the main reason we wanted to add them to another park. And Camden was chosen because of the large tracts of uh, open grassland on the west side of the park that didn't have a lot of trails. It's mostly just burned occasionally and isn't kind of maybe managed. It doesn't have as much disturbance as it could have to keep it in a really nice condition. So we felt like grazing could benefit there. And this park, it will actually be rather hard to see the bison compared to our other parks. So it isn't really for that public attraction piece. If people want to see bison, there's easier places to see them. So this was more for kind of reintroducing those genetic conservation and for the prairie management. And I will say, we are actually going to be doing a lot more monitoring and grazing specific monitoring at Camden, and we're also going to monitor birds, insects, and I'm looking for somebody to do dung beetles. So if you know of any undergraduate or graduate researchers who want to do dung beetles, I think it'd be really fun to do that when we reintroduce at Camden. So
Yeah, it would be great to know what the response are from all those other groups that taxonomic groups that we care about out on the prairie.
yep.
Um, well, let's see. Doesn't look like there's any more
All right, that's good timing.
questions right now, and our timing is good. So, Molly, I thank you very much for your time and expertise today, and thanks everybody for joining us. Again, I mentioned
Oh, you went on mute.
went on mute. There we go. I pushed the right buttons. We have two more webinars. One coming up on March 4th and one on March 11th. I put our a link to the website in the chat there, so folks can go and register for those. And again, thanks, Molly, and everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.